And yeah, again, just a reminder to please mute yourself out of respect for the presenter. Okay, so I will now like to introduce Eric Mongrain. Eric is an analyst at Statistics Canada responsible for the production of the Longitudinal Immigration Database. I will also note that Mike Dieter, Senior Analyst at the Community Data Program, will also give a quick presentation at the end of following Eric's presentation and just highlight some of the offerings that are available through the Community Data Program. So I will now pass that over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Sasha. As Sasha mentioned, my name is Eric Mongrain. I'm an analyst responsible for production of the Longitudinal Immigration Database, otherwise known as the IMDB. I apologize in advance. I pulled my back pretty bad this weekend, and I've got some muscle relaxants in me, so if I seem a little spacey or loopy, that's the reasoning behind it. If I'm a little shifty or you hear me grunt or groan, I've had better days. All that being said, I'll share my screen now and get right into it. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep, you're all good.
Wonderful. So today I'm going to talk about the IMDB, also known as the Longitudinal Immigration Database. Particularly, I'm going to mention or I'm going to talk about or describe how it's a tool to assess socioeconomic outcomes of immigrants and non-permanent residents in Canada. So quickly.
Eric, just wondering if there's any way you can make it full screen.
Yes, I can.
Thanks so much.
So briefly, I'm going to talk about the IMDB. In terms of coverage, that's more of a technical term, but I'll talk about it. Goes hand in hand with exactly what it is. So I'll spend some time describing the IMDB, and I'll describe the data modules therein. I'm going to use a case study and as well as some examples to describe these modules and why they're relevant for analysis. And I'll have some examples of the products that we have available publicly online, including a demonstration of the interactive applications that I think are pretty neat. First and foremost, I'd like to mention that the IMDB is funded by IRCC, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, as well as the 10 provinces. What the IMDB is we integrate immigration and citizenship data with socioeconomic outcomes for detailed population research and analysis. So in other words, we take administrative immigration data from IRCC and we merge that with tax data from CRA that's been processed. And the final result is a longitudinal data set that looks at socioeconomic outcomes of immigrants over the course of 40, we have to this day, 39 years from 1982 to 2019, and shortly up to 20 years of tax data. These results are accessible through online tables, research publications, custom tabs, and microdata, as well as accessible at research data centers, RDCs. So some quick context about immigration in Canada. There are two residency options in Canada. We have non-permanent residency. Another term for that is temporary residency. There's people who are allocated permits in the country to be here temporarily, if it's a study permit or a work permit or otherwise. And we have permanent residency, also known as a landed immigrant or immigrating to Canada. Immigrants are admitted as permanent residents for different reasons, as described here. The majority of immigrants immigrating in the modern era are coming through our economic programs. But they can also come through for family-sponsored reasons, or they can become here refugees seeking asylum. According to the 2016 census, immigrants represent around 22% of the population. And as of October 26th, we'll get the updated number for what proportion of the population immigrants represent in Canada. So, as I mentioned, the IMDB is an administrative database. It's really important context to have. We're using admin data. Now, the reason why that's so relevant to bring up more than once is that its intended purpose isn't necessarily for analysis. It's for administrative bookkeeping, both the immigration administrative side as well as the tax side. But we take those and repurpose it to create this beautiful longitudinal database that can be used for fairly advanced analysis. So it's an administrative database updated annually that combines immigration data from IRCC with tax data from CRA. We have coverage for immigrants or permanent residents and non-permanent residents or temporary residents. That includes foreign workers and national students and asylum claimants. It allows for the study of socioeconomic outcomes and mobility by controlling for the socio-demographic characteristics of individuals. What that means in more words is that generally what we look for is landing characteristics, something like, let's say, the immigration program under which an immigrant will grant the permanent residency. If it's being an economic immigrant, skilled worker, or provincial nominee, those are particular programs that are designed so that the persons being selected are coming to Canada for their ability to contribute to the Canadian economy. So let's say we're restricting our analysis, or rather we're controlling our analysis for things like the immigration programs under which they were admitted, and then we look at their tax outcomes over time. So that's the power of the IMDB. And with that, you can have longitudinality. So you could say, okay, let's look at a cohort who landed in 2000, and let's look at their tax outcomes therein by landing characteristics like the immigration programs they immigrated under, what countries they came from, what language they speak at the time of landing, and things of that nature. So more about the IMDB product, as it were. So up to fairly recently, 2015, I guess it isn't so recent anymore, up to 7 years ago, the IMDB was just restricted to immigrant tax filers admitted since 1980. So it's a very small group compared to what we have now. I've got a long list here of recent developments. Briefly, the major, or the biggest, or rather the improvement of the greatest magnitude was the fact that we added non-permanent residency, so people with temporary resident permits, as well as permanent residents since 1952 to 1979, albeit limited data for that, as well as we include all permanent residents. So the IMDB today includes all permanent residents since 1952, temporary residents and their permits since 1980, tax data from 1982 to 2019, soon to be 2020. And then we've added these other different modules to increase the scope and power of the IMDB, including data from the T4, which I'll get into a little bit later. For each of these modules that are going to be here, wages and salaries, children, family data, express entry, settlement services, I'll provide succinct examples as to why that's relevant and provides powerful analysis. We've also included some other new variables to the IMDB over the years, and you'll get to look at those in more detail later. So briefly, this is kind of a conceptual visualization of what the IMDB covers. I said it in words, but now you get to see it in pictures, I suppose. So on the left side is the immigration administrative data, which includes permanent residency files, citizenship records, express entry, which I'll talk about later, settlement services, which I'll also talk about later, temporary resident permits, and we link that to to tax data and other administrative data, such as the tax files. We've derived some custom tax files based on immigrant children. We've got directly the T4 data, which is wages and salaries, and we also link to mortality records to increase the quality and coverage of our linkage and to have information like death date on the IMDB. So I don't want to spend too much time on this graph. There's a lot going on. So briefly, the bars represent the count of immigrants if it were tax filers or non-filers. So the light blue is tax filers, the dark blue is non-tax filers. This is important because when we're looking at socioeconomic outcomes, we're predominantly focused on the tax filing population. But there are still important characteristics of the non-tax filing population that do analysis on. And there are two lines, one's a dotted yellow line, one's a black line. Those are relevant for the axis on the right side. The axis on the right side was a proportion of those we managed to link to tax files. So what you're looking at, for example, if you look at the year 2000, and we work our way up, right? The year 2000 has a fairly consistent coverage. We're linking over 90% of all immigrants who landed in that cohort group. And the reason why we put both the dotted line for 2019 and the black line, so the black line represents all tax filers ever. 2019 represents tax files in 2019. So you can see that we have fairly good coverage of this population when we're trying to do analysis. So again, if you're trying to, what this graph represents, I mean, one, it shows the numbers, which are interesting, but the dotted lines represent the robustness of the data set. So you could truly dig down into particular characteristics if you want to split it 9 ways from Sunday, right? You could look at immigration program by age, by gender, by knowledge of official language, by pre-mission experience, and still have a robust enough population to do some relevant analysis if it's using descriptive stats or something more in depth, like a logistic regression. So like I mentioned from the outset, I was going to provide some succinct examples as to how you could use the IMDB to solve, say, for example, questions about policy or things of that nature. So what I'm going to provide is a case study in the way you could use the IMDB to answer particular policy questions. This example is about the Francophone immigration goal. So Canada had an action plan for official languages that was going to last from 2019 to 2023. Generally speaking, one of the major points was to increase Francophone immigration to a target of 4.4% of French-speaking immigrants outside of Quebec by 2023, among other important points to try and what's what I'm looking for. Along with the 4.4% of French-speaking immigrants outside of Quebec, there are other parts of this policy that the IMDB could be helped to use. Wow, I'm really losing my words here again. the back pain is not greatest for thinking. Let me restart this slide. So the IMDB can be used as a tool to assess government policies. The example I'm trying to give is a case study for Francophone immigration goals. So Canada Action Plan 2019-2023. One of the major points was trying to increase Francophone immigration to target a 4.4% of French-speaking immigrants outside of Quebec by 2023. The IMDB can be used as a tool to help assess the outcomes of French-speaking immigrants outside of Quebec. So one example you could use is looking at something like entry wages. This is a fairly common analysis point for the IMDB. So the example is, how do the wages of French-speaking immigrants compare with those of English-speaking immigrants 1 year after admission to Canada? So this cohort we're looking at is the group of those immigrants who were admitted in the year 2018, and we're looking at 2019 wages. So you could see there are a few examples here. Quebec's highlighted in green. So we see French-speaking immigrants in Quebec tend to have slightly higher wages than English-speaking immigrants in Quebec, which kind of makes intuitive sense. And then we look at the group of French-speaking immigrants outside of Quebec, and we can see that those wages are comparable to those who speak English. Although you can see the numbers here are vastly different, right? We have 3,200-ish French-speaking immigrants outside of Quebec versus 160,000. So take these numbers with a grain of salt. And then we have other examples for particular provinces like New Brunswick, Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia. Again, the number of French-speaking immigrants outside of Quebec is fairly small. Another way to look at this, to view this, and this is where the power of the IMDB comes into play with its robustness, as I was mentioning earlier, is you could break it down by different landing characteristics. When we're looking at something like breaking it down by the immigration category in which they had immigrated to the country or granted their permanent residency. So what you see here is a kind of two parts of the same coin. On the left side, we're looking at entry wages for the top 5 most populous immigration categories by knowledge of official language at the time of landing. And on the right side is their incidence of wages, which is kind of a proxy for being employed. So you could look at, for example, of what we were looking at previously. I'll go to this slide really quickly. When we're looking at Canada outside Quebec.
Eric,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. There's just a comment in the chat. If you don't mind just slowing down your presentation, yeah. I think some people are just having there's a lot of information, so just so people can have a second to kind of absorb it.
Thank you for the reminder. I tend to speak quickly. I'll make a conscious effort to slow down a little bit.
Thanks for coming despite the back injury.
Yeah, no,
we really appreciate that.
We'll fight through it. So I'll slow down a little bit. I apologize. I tend to speak quickly. So for this particular table, as I mentioned, we're looking at the 2018 cohort. So these are immigrants who immigrated in the year 2018, were granted their permanent residency. They could have been in the country before that, but they were granted their permanent residency in the year 2018. And we're looking at their incomes 1 year later, specifically their wages. This would be T4 incomes. So the example here is to look at, okay, well, how are French-speaking immigrants doing compared to English-speaking immigrants across different provinces within the country? When we look at Quebec, you could see that the wages for French-speaking immigrants are somewhat better than those who speak English, which again is a little bit of intuitive because obviously Quebec is a lot more of a francophone province than the rest of the country. When we look at overall Canada outside Quebec, the numbers are somewhat similar, 33.5 versus 34.3. However, as I mentioned previously, taking a look at the numbers gives you some context as to, or rather would make you take these numbers with a grain of salt, because we're looking at 3,200 people versus 160,000. And a similar story could be told for the other provinces in this example. And when we're looking at this, you can get some context as to why those numbers may look the way they do by breaking it down by something like immigration programs. So as I said previously, and I'll say it slower this time, I apologize. When we're looking at two sides of the same coin to some degree, on the left side, we have the entry wages of immigrants by their knowledge of official language at admission, by the immigration program in which they immigrated under. Right here is just the top 5 amongst 20, amongst even more details if required in the microdata. And on the right side, we have the incidence of wages by that same breakdown. An incidence of wage could be used as some sort of proxy for employment. So we could see here that there isn't much of a difference across some of these categories, like spouses, sponsored spouses or partners. This program is if you're a permanent resident or a Canadian citizen and you sponsor your spouse to come live in the country with you. We have skilled workers and skilled workers. Those are individuals who are specifically selected for their contributions to the Canadian economy. We have a particular subcategory here. You can see it's called principal applicant. And on the far right side, we have dependent. There's a distinction between the two. Principal applicants are being the ones selected for their ability to contribute in Canada if it's their level of education, previous work experience, knowledge of official languages. This dependent subcategory is their spouses and children. So you can see that there is a difference amongst the categories, not so much for something like skilled worker or Canadian experience class, but when we look at a category like protected persons in Canada, in the subcategory of refugee are those who come to Canada and claim asylum and are then granted permanent residency therein. Or, for example, the skilled worker, the dependents of the skilled worker. So this is the spouses and children who may not have the work or education experience, or rather the knowledge of official language that the principal applicant might have. And you can see there is a small distinction between the two. So this population we're looking at is Canada outside of Quebec. You can see that French-speaking immigrants do fairly well outside of Quebec compared to the English counterparts, except when we get to particular categories, like, for example, protected person in Canada and skilled workers. I'm going to flip back to the other slide really quickly just to give some more context. So when we see something like, British Columbia might have higher wages for French-speaking immigrants compared to English-speaking immigrants. Well, the question we have to ask is, well, is this because the fact that there are more people who are from Canadian experience class living in British Columbia, or is it because more protected persons are living elsewhere? So again, everything you see with a grain of salt, but the point I'm trying to make is that you can break these populations down to a very granular level to really understand what's going on. And as I mentioned on the right side, we have a graph of the incidence, which is another statistic that we can easily pull out of the IMDB to understand proxies for things like employment for particular groups. And these graphs are just an example, but you can include anything, like I said, country of birth, region of birth, country of citizenship, knowledge of official language at landing, if they had pre-admission experience or not. So the options are really limitless. And it's really hard to convey in a presentation like this the power of longitudinality, because right now we're only looking at 1 year after admission, but what does it look like 5, 6, 7 years after admission? What happens if you do like survival analysis or logistic regression to try and pull out the power of some of these programs to see what's really affecting outcomes? So this is kind of just the tip of the iceberg of what you can do with the IMDB. Another thing that we like to measure a lot with the IMDB is immigrant mobility. This is the concept predicated on the fact that when people are granted permanent residency, they're asked what their intended province or geography or city or residence is going to be. They're going to say, okay, I'm going to become a permanent resident in Canada and I'm going to live in Toronto. And then we say, okay, what does the tax data say 5 years down the road? Did they actually live in Toronto? How long were they there for? How well do some provinces retain their immigrants based on, let's say, immigration program? So quickly, like I mentioned, we have intended province or intended geography, so where they plan to live, and we have the current province of residence. So we say, let's look at the cohort, for example, of those who immigrated to the country in 2014, and where were they living 5 years later, based on their tax filing. So what we're looking at here is the intended province of destination by the knowledge of official language at time of admission for the 2014 cohort, and where they and did they stay or leave in the year 2019. So on the far left, we have Quebec. The color scheme here isn't great, I apologize. But what ostensibly it's saying is on the far left bar here are French-speaking immigrants, the middle is English, and the far right is neither English nor French. We can see that, well, of those who were admitted in 2014 and said they were going to live in Quebec, around 94% stayed there after 5 years. This term is called a retention rate, and you can see that it's fairly high, but again, this is relatively intuitive because Quebec is primarily a French-speaking province. French-speaking immigrants would probably tend to stay there even over time. And then we shift our focus to other provinces as an example. You look at Ontario, where the French-speaking population, 85% of them stayed after 5 years, but relative to the English population, it seems like English-speaking immigrants are more likely to stay in Ontario. In the same case, it's to be made for British Columbia and Alberta. So this is just an example of the other primary analysis we use at the IMDB to understand the mobility of immigrants based on their tax filing. I see there are a few questions in the chat. I'm wondering if it's worthwhile to tackle some of these now before I move on to the modules. So I'll answer the IMDB census linkage question after. For the question about statistical significance, I'll talk about that right now briefly. So the IMDB is technically a census of all immigrants. It's not a sample survey. You could still apply techniques of statistical significance when you're comparing populations together, right? But generally speaking, you don't have to worry about things like sample frame or weighting when you're doing these kinds of things. Simon, for your question about people who are bilingual, in this particular case, yes. But it depends what they answer at the time of admission. So if they say that they're French-speaking immigrants or their knowledge of official language is both French and English, in these cases, we're not including them in either of these analyses. neither this graph or the previous graphs. We're looking at those who are identified as either French-speaking or English-speaking. There's some complexity in the data when they're bilingual, and we're looking at this particular subject matter. But in this case, no, it's just French or English or neither. And Peter, to answer your question about what are the available geographies, we have information all the way down to the census subdivision level on the IMDB. Again, it's a census of all immigrants and their tax data, although I will say that at really, really low levels of geography, when you're looking at things like mobility, it can kind of get complicated because populations are fairly small and we round to the 10 when we release data. So if you're looking at a difference between 10 and 20, right, looking at retention rate, it can be drastically different. There could be drastic differences in those numbers. But when it comes to the income data, no, it's super robust. So I'll pause from answering questions and I'll move on with the presentation for now. So as I mentioned earlier on, I wanted to talk about some of the modules that we've added to the IMDB and why there's some analytical value attached to it. Previously, what I was talking about is what we call quote unquote the core IMDB, where we're looking at permanent and temporary residents linked to T1FF, which is the T1 family file, which is the tax data that we link to. Recently, we've started including a direct linkage to the T4, which I'm sure, as all of us have had jobs at one point in our career or at one point in our lives, you're allocated T4 when you're working for an employer. So what this module adds to the analytical capacity of the IMDB are a few things. One, it does provide additional coverage of specifically the temporary foreign worker population. It's great for that, as temporary foreign workers are a naturally transient population. I mean, they're, by virtue of the fact that they're temporary foreign workers, are here temporarily. They may or may not apply or file for their T1s. However, their employers file T4s on their behalf. So we can get additional coverage of that population, as well as the fact that the T4 files are generally ready earlier than the T1FF files, so we can get an additional year of coverage. What this graph is representing, what you see here, is providing the robustness or the additional coverage we can have of this population based on T4s. More specifically, what it's looking at is the coverage of temporary residents, excluding asylum claimants, with an active work permit. So that means that their permit in a given year is valid, who have never transitioned or not yet transitioned to permanent residency. So we're looking at specifically the temporary population. And then we're looking at by the different types of tax data. So we have T1FF and T4 data in yellow, only T1FF data in orange, and the only newly added T4 data in blue. So as you can see, there are significant gains year over year for this population, and then only gains in the year 2020 because we don't have T1FF yet available for that year. For some context, the reason why we exclude asylum claims from this analysis is because asylum claimants technically, once they're granted asylum, there's no end date to that permit, unlike study permits or temporary work permits where there's a fixed time period in which they're valid. And again, just to summarize, the analytical capacity added by this module is that A, you have a better coverage of studying the outcomes of temporary residents, even though they may or may not be in the country or may or may not file T1s. And two, we get an additional year of coverage for everybody, including permanent residents. So if you're looking for more timely data, this would be a really relevant data set to use. Another new addition to the IMDB is what we call the immigrant children module. So about a quarter of immigrants admitted since 1980 were children at the time of their admission, so under 18 years old when they were admitted. So we don't really have tax data for the first few years of their life in the country. What we've done is we've attached parental income sources while they were children. So they're children and we have their parents' tax data, and we link them together to understand their socioeconomic outcomes as children and how that affects them as adults. So an example here, and a really powerful one, I think, I have two graphs here. The one on the left shows the median employment income by age group at admission. This is for the 2017 tax year. But you'll see the same trend if we're using 2020 data. So there are three lines. Blue is age 0 to 4 time of admission. So they immigrated at age 0 or to 4. The orange line is aged 5 to 9. And then the gray line is 10 to 14. So you can see there's a drastic difference in the economic outcomes as adults based on when they immigrated as children. So the younger you immigrate, the more likely you are to have higher wages when you're an adult. Similarly, the graph on the right describes children admitted before 5 years old. So they immigrated 0 to 4. And whether or not, while they were children, they were living in a low-income household. Like I said, we're attaching the income characteristics of their parents to them while they're children. So we can understand, okay, well, their parents were considered low income for a few years while they were children living in the same household. How does that affect their incomes when they're adults? When I say they, I mean the children. So we see here the blue line represents those who were never in a low-income family while they were children, and the orange line represents those who at some point were in a low-income family while they were children. And you can see when they are, the x-axis here, we're showing their age as adults. You could see that the incomes of those who never lived in a low-income family are drastically higher than those who did live in a low-income family, which is relatively intuitive because there's a lot of research about intergenerational stickiness of income and things like that. So this data set, albeit a little more complex than the IMDB, can provide some really important answers about things like generation 1.5, which are immigrant children, which are not really available anywhere else. Something we've added recently as well is the express entry module. So in 2015, there were policy changes at IRCC, and they introduced a new economic immigration program called express entry, which ostensibly is a revamped point system. And we have recently added this data to the IMDB. So if you're curious about how the point system or how the characteristics at admission based on the point system can have effect on long-term outcomes, we haven't done a lot of analysis with this yet, but it is available for users. And the last one I wanted to talk about is our settlement services module. So we have data available since 2013 for settlement services, and since 2015 for foreign services. So if we received Canadian settlement services outside of the country, we have that data available on the IMDB. So these are federally funded settlement service providers that are providing these kinds of services to individuals in the country. These services include things like language training, language assessment, employment-related services, orientation once you get to the country, and things of that nature. And this graph that I'm going to show next, there's a lot here. So I'm going to get a sip of water while you digest it, and I'll talk about it. So what we're seeing here are the median wages of the 2014 federal skilled workers cohort. So these are people who were selected as federal skilled workers. They were assessed based on their level of education, work experience, and the government of Canada assessed, okay, well, they'll contribute positively to our economy. This is the 2014 group, and we're looking at the first year in which they received employment-related settlement services. And what we're looking at here is their tax data year over year from there. So on the left, far left side, these are individuals who never received employment-related services. So the assumption would be that they never needed the help, and therefore they may have more success than the other groups. As you can see, in the second group here, first service received in 2014. So this is the cohort of 2014 federal skilled workers. They received employment-related services in their first year, and you can see that there's an upward trajectory, a positive upward trajectory of their incomes since. And we look at the third group here. These individuals who were admitted in 2014 received employment-related services in 2015, and you can see their tax filings year over year, an upward positive trend. And you see that same trend we look at, they received services 2 years after admission, 3 years, 4 years, and then this final example. So you can see what this would suggest is that the employment-related services had a positive impact on their income earnings after they received the service. Again, this is fairly nebular in that this is the highest level of information we could provide. We're not looking at, say, for example, country of origin or breakdown by age or things of that nature, but it provides some interesting analysis possible with the settlement services. I see a question here. The module presented prior to settlement services. This is the express entry module. I'll just go over it really quickly again. So ostensibly in 2015, IRCC revamped their economic immigration program. And with that, they included a new way in which they rank ordered the applicants under the economic programs. So it's a revamped point system. And this module includes some of those informations, like the points allocated for level of education, for example. Like I said, we haven't done a lot of analysis on this internally yet. I just wanted to let users know that this is available if something that people were curious about. So that's kind of broadly speaking what the IMDB encompasses. It's a lot of information. I know I'm going over it fairly quickly. I did want to get to this interactive aspect so I could demonstrate the power of the interactive applications. But the IMDB is big. Like I said, we've got all immigrants since 1952, temporary residents and their permits since 1980, all of their tax data since 1982. We've got settlement services, we've got citizenship data, we've got express entry data, we've got T4 data. So it's a fairly sizable database And I just, it's very powerful, especially the fact that it's longitudinal and that scale. The depth of analysis that can be done is quite outstanding. And not only are the descriptive tables somewhat powerful, but you can really dig deep with things like survival analysis and multifactorial analysis and things of that nature. So quickly, I wanted to mention some of the online products I have available to anybody at any time. These are publicly available on our website. The easiest way to get there is this link in the immigration portal, which will link to all the data products as well as relevant analyses, not just with the IMDB, but anything across the immigration subject matter. If you wanted to really get in depth about what the IMDB is, I recommend reading the technical report. It might put you to sleep with the details, but it really gets to the nitty gritty about what the IMDB is and how to use it. And that's available online as well. If anyone plans on digging deep into the microdata, I highly recommend reading that first. We have dynamic tables. So these are our standard issue public tables that we release every year. We release 10 tables a year, and they vary from economic outcomes to mobility. We've got a table about asylum claimants in Canada, and we've got a table about the outcomes of immigrant children based on that children's module. So the last thing I wanted to mention, and I wanted to be a brief demonstration of, is our interactive applications. We've got 2 online. Like I mentioned, IMDB, broadly speaking, we look at 2 subjects: economic outcomes and the mobility of immigrants. So this is the first one. This is an interactive application that describes the economic outcomes of immigrants in Canada. So the data that feeds this is online in the form of a data table, but this is a little bit more fun and colorful. It takes the numbers and puts it into pictures, and who doesn't want that? So what you're looking at, I'll try and zoom in here a little bit. What you're looking at here are the economic outcomes over time of immigrants to Canada by many ways to slice it. So what we're looking right now is the admission year, 2009. So this is the 2009 cohort. And what we're looking here is their years since admission. So year 1 since admission would be the year 2010. Year 10 would be the year 2019. So these are the tax data being represented by lines here. And we could see very quickly over time, wow, economic immigrant principal applicants, the blue line, does very well compared to the other groups, which is relatively intuitive because these are individuals being selected specifically for their ability to contribute to the Canadian economy. But further than that, what this interactive application can do is, if you wanted to say, for example, compare the incidence of wages and salaries. So it's a slightly different graph. Again, this can be used as a proxy for employment. If you wanted to look at the incidence of social assistance, who's receiving social assistance, the first thing we see is the yellow line of refugees is among the highest of the other groups. And again, that would be relatively intuitive. On the left side here, we have the distribution of those population groups within Canada. So the 2019 cohort in 2019, there's almost an even split between sponsored by family, economic principal applicants, economic spouse dependents. Then we have our split for refugees and other immigrants. And a few more things quickly I wanted to show you. Like I mentioned, it's really quick and easy with this tool to slice and dice the data in various ways. So up here we have, for example, if you wanted to study the population in Alberta who were female, who spoke English and had let's say a work permit before they were admitted. What does this group look like? Well, this is what this group looks like over time. If you wanted to look more specifically at, let's say, the economic categories, let's broaden this just a little bit so we get more data in here. You can click this button and you get the breakdown of all the immigration programs and how they do compare to each other. So you can see at the top here, we've got skilled workers, and then we've got Canadian experience class, virtual territorial nominees. If you hover over, you get even more details of the specific median wages and salaries. So you can get a lot of information very quickly with this graph when it comes to economic outcomes. I will point out one more thing. There's this yellow button that says help. And here we'll describe what's going on in all the graphs, how to use them. And at the top right here, there's this instructions button. It describes what we think is the best way to go about designing your cohort to study. So if you do use this interactive application, I highly recommend clicking on the help button from the outset, because it really describes what's going on and how to use it. And I wanted to quickly show you the mobility application as well, just to give you a brief overview of what that looks like, if you're ever interested or curious to see what individual mobility amongst immigrant groups looks like. This one's a little more complicated. Because when we're looking at this, we're looking at immigrant tax filers based on their intended province of destination versus where they're living X amount of time later. So what we have here, the same characteristics for slicing and dicing. We have our overall stats here, and we've got a map of Canada. So let's say you were interested in studying the interprovincial mobility of immigrants who we'll use Alberta again. So they originally intended to live in Alberta. We're looking at the 2014 admission cohort in 2019, 5 years later. The common indicator we use to measure mobility is called the retention rate, which is this number right here. So if we wanted to see, okay, who stayed in Alberta? Simply click on the province, right? And the great part about this interactive app is all the titles are dynamic. So whenever you're looking at something, it tells you exactly what you're looking at. In this case, we're looking at immigrant tax filers admitted to Alberta in 2014 who are residing in Alberta 5 years after admission. In this case, 89% of them stayed after 5 years. If you were to, for example, hover over Ontario, again, the title tells you what you're looking at. So immigrant tax filers admitted to Alberta in 2014 who are residing in Ontario 5 years after admission. So all this information is available fairly quickly at your fingertips. If you wanted to look more in detail about these categories, you can filter them. So if you want to look at specifically provincial territorial nominees who spoke English and had, I don't know, a work permit before they immigrated to Canada, you get that number really quickly. So 92.7% of immigrants who originally intended to live in Alberta, who were provincial territorial nominees, who spoke English, who had a work permit, 93% of them decided to stay 5 years after. Again, there's this helpful help button. I highly recommend looking at this before using the data. And again, there are instructions as well to how to design a proper cohort analysis using this. Briefly, some of the data that IMDB is linked with. We are part of the ELMLP, which is the Education Labor Market Longitudinal Platform. So that's linking IMDB data to administrative education data to understand outcomes therein. We're also linked to the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, and we'll have information on CERB tax data come the next iteration of the IMDB being released December 5th. We're also linked to the Community Health Survey, the Discharge Abstract Database for the DAD. We're linked to the LSIC, which is Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Canada. This survey, I think, ended in 2000, so it's fairly old data, but they had relevant questions about what's life like in Canada for immigrants. And we're also linked to the Longitudinal Administrative Data Bank, which is a 20% sample of all tax data in the country. Lastly, I want to reiterate the fact that the IMDB is a collaboration between the provinces, IRCC, and Statistics Canada. This collaboration has allowed the data integration between the IMDB and other data sources, as well as IRCC. The provinces provide funding to access data, and the IRCC has improved access to the research community. So quickly about the Data Service Center. So the DSC offers to data users a complete range of services. It assists data users with simple and free data requests, technical methodological questions, with complex requests requiring research extraction and customization of data from multiple sources, by producing customized reports, analysis, and maps, by offering standard and customized workshops for data users of all levels of expertise, and through various outreach activities such as webinars like this one, newsletters, presentations, information sessions, and open houses. As Sasha mentioned, this presentation, these slides will be available to you after the presentation, and I'm happy to field any questions. I'll start with the ones that are already in the chat.
I thought we could just maybe get Mike to actually do his presentation now, and then we can go into questions because they might be relevant to both of you.
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, if anyone has any other questions, put them in the chat and we can get to them in a couple moments here.
Thanks, Eric. Let me just share my screen. So I'll just quickly go over what we have in the community data catalog. Is everyone hearing and seeing my screen okay?
Yes, we can hear you and see the screen fine.
So yeah, we were pretty excited to get IMDB data for the community data program a few years ago. A lot of this came out of a partnership that we have with the National LIP Secretariat, the Local Immigration Partnership, that is helping somewhat to fund our acquisition of data from the IMDB and possibly from IRCC. Let me just quickly go through how you would find some of the data tables in our catalog. If you're familiar with our site, I'm not going to do like a tour on the site. I thought that this could be useful if people are looking at the slide decks later. You know, just going to our the Find Data button at the top screen of our site will bring you to the catalog, and you can just search. It has its own product group for the IMDB. If you are a member of the immigration sector network, so that's the network of LIPs that are sort of form a sector-based consortium, then you can always use the main catalog page to search for what you're looking for. Members of the immigration sector network can only download data tables that are related to immigration, but you can look through the catalog to see what we have, and or you can go through the portals menu and to the immigration data portal, which will bring you here, and then clicking on data resources would bring you to the list of tables that are available to the immigration sector network. So when you go to our catalog, you'd see probably about 20 tables listed under IMDB products, but really they can be classified into 4 tables that we have at different geographic levels and for different tax years. And those 4 tables could be categorized as either belonging to the standard or what Eric had described as sort of core IMDB tables. And then we also recently acquired tables with iCare data. So that's from the Settlement Services data module, iCare being the Immigration Contribution Agreement reporting environment. And then for each of these tables, as was mentioned before, we split the tables out. One table would focus on economic outcomes, and then another table would focus on mobility. So if you're looking at the tables that have from the core IMDB tables, these were the first tables that we got from the IMDB group. I've just described here in general terms the dimensions or the collection of variables that are available in each of the tables, and generally each of these dimensions you can cross-tabulate with any of the other ones. So all of the tables in all the tables that we acquired are going to have admission year, the tax year that we're looking at, age and sex, and admission category is going to be in there somewhere. And then we wanted to have a profile of immigrants in the that are captured in the tables. So these are the dimensions that we settled on in consultation with the data and purchase and access working group and with the LIP data working group. So knowledge of official language, world area of birth, and citizenship or pre-admission experience. And then again, so the tables will all have those variables in one form or another, and then would have either economic measures in them or mobility measures. And you can see the examples of what variables might be included in those dimensions. So, the structure can vary a little bit from table to table. With the census division data, the tables were smaller, so we could fit, this profile dimension with knowledge of official languages and whatnot, all in one dimension. But say for census subdivisions, which represent municipalities, or because there's more of them, this profile dimension essentially had to be split out into 3 separate tables. Yeah, that is a good sort of overview of what those would look like. With the iCare tables, again, you'll see admission year, tax year, age, and sex in there. The admission category variables are mixed in with world area of birth. And then, of course, because we're looking at the settlement services data module, there is a dimension that looks at the settlement services that were received. And once again, you can cross-tabulate these with either economic measures or mobility measures. And we acquire data at the census division level and at the census subdivision level. So that's census divisions being, your regional municipalities or counties, census subdivisions being, cities and municipalities. And we also acquired the data at LIP custom geographies. And these typically represent the service areas or study areas that were of interest to the LIP working group. Frequently, they are large regions or aggregations of census subdivisions. And as described before, the universe for these tables are immigrant tax filers aged 15 and over. So this just gives a broad picture of what we have in the catalog from these tables. We are looking, we'll keep acquiring data from the IMDB year over year because it is updated with tax filer, new tax filer data and new admissions data every year. And we have spoken with the National LIP Secretariat about producing some sort of Tableau product, likely an infographic or maybe a dashboard that could help to slice and dice the data. And who knows, depending on use of the data or demand from the various working groups, we may see about breaking out into some of the other data modules. But for now, this is what we've explored. I'm going to cut this presentation short just so we can get to the questions, but it would be good to let you know we are talking with the LIP group, but it would be open to all CDP members to have a webinar where we dive into the IMDB tables in a little more detail. It'd be more of a workshop format. We could go through some examples of what you can calculate and how you would do that with the tables that we have. But I will turn it back over to Eric and Sasha so we can answer questions. How do I stop sharing?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike, for that presentation. Yeah, as we've noted previously, all this material will be made available through the Community Data Program website. I know it's been a lot of information, so feel free to reach out to myself or Mike, and we can always help answer more specific questions if you're working with the IMDB table. So now I think we can turn back to some of the questions that have been posed in the chat. I don't know, Eric, if you want to. There's a couple that make sense to kind of logically address together, or I can read them off for you as I come in.
I was just going to go from the top of the chat and work my way down,
Yeah.
Or we can you could filter some out for me and ask ones you think are relevant. I don't mind staying a few extra minutes to answer these questions. It's not a problem to me. So
perfect. Yeah, we can just start from the top then.
Sure.
So the first question is, how long are you considered an immigrant for?
Forever, technically. I mean, once you immigrate to Canada, you're considered an immigrant to Canada. If you're granted permanent residency, I think you have 5 years to get your citizenship, and then you have to reapply for permanent residency otherwise. But if you're an immigrant to Canada, technically, I mean, it's what we call the tombstone variable, right? It's one thing that's immutable. Once it happens, it's happened. Although you could technically leave and come back and immigrate again, which is somewhat rare, but that happens.
Perfect, thank you. The next question, I think you touched on this a little bit, but I think maybe important just to reiterate is, I'm wondering how the IMDB table is linked to the census of population data for counts of immigrants and postal codes.
So there are a few linkages to the census. All the way back to 2006, I think we started doing it for data validation purposes. So we would link not necessarily IMDB, but the administrative immigration data. The most recent version of this linkage that's available within the RDCs and for public or for custom tabulations is we've linked the IMDB to the 2016 census. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I could talk about this for an hour, but ostensibly the census would be the base of information and we add IMDB information to it. So we're adding characteristics at landing of individuals to the census. So say, for example, you wanted to know what the knowledge of official language at admission was. So if they landed in 2000, in 2016, they say they speak English or French. What did they speak at the time of landing? You can make that comparison. How they actually link it, it's a fairly complex and detailed methodological process that involves linking based on things like first name, last name, date of birth. That would be like a week-long seminar in and of itself, the nitty-gritty of how that actually gets done. But we use information like that to attach IMDb information or any information to the census, for example. Well, I guess more specifically, you asked about counts of immigrants, postal codes. Those things are on the census already. The census asks the question in 2016, are you an immigrant, yes or no? And then they ask all the other questions they have in the census. So that's how they got that information. So I might have answered the wrong question, but we do actually, aside from that, link the IMDb to the census for other analytical purposes.
And there's a kind of a related question asking if it's linked to the community health survey.
Yes, the IMDb is linked to the CCHS. I don't remember when the last iteration of it was. I don't think they do it every year, but they have linked it in the past. And I do think that's also available, but we wouldn't be the custodians of that data. You'd have to talk to the CCHS team for that specifically. Or rather, since you're not at StatsCan, you probably have to ask the DAD team. Figure out what that stands for, but there are essentially our team who manages microdata access. But it is linked to CCHS. It's also linked to the GSS, the General Social Survey, and many other databases for both data validation and for analytical purposes as well.
And then the next question, just in reference to the two tools that you showed online, is there plans in the future to show, like I noted that it's only goes down to the province, but is there plans in the future to show those tools or adapt those tools to show smaller levels of geography?
Not as of today. Maybe in the future, but right now, generally speaking, like those are for the broad public, and may not necessarily for detailed analysis that may be warranted at the CD level. As I mentioned, the IMDb is a very robust data set. It's a census of all immigrants who've ever been admitted since 1952. It's mostly focused on 1980 forward, as well as all taxes since 1982. So we have a lot of people to look at, a lot of information to look at. Once you start slicing and dicing things at those levels of geography, you might start encountering problems of low counts. So at the CD level, I don't think we'll ever publicly release anything. I mean, never say never. There are no plans right now to release anything at that level. We do have data tables available at the CMA, the Census Metropolitan Area, and the Economic Region level, but nothing as low as CD. Now, that being said, I'm sure there could be conversations about custom tools at that level. So if somebody wanted something like that, that could be done. It's viable, but no plans to do it publicly.
Perfect. Yeah, and I will note that that's something that we've actually talked about internally at the CDP about creating some Tableau products that show the IMDb tables at lower levels of geography. So something members can potentially access in the future.
And the IMDb itself at the tax level. So when we're looking at, at the geography level, we have it all the way down to the CSD level, census subdivision. So as Mike mentioned, I'd be looking at particular neighborhoods perhaps within a CMA. So if you're looking at Ottawa, for example, the east side of Ottawa would be separated from central Ottawa versus the west side at the census subdivision level.
The next question, again, I think is in reference to the tools that you were showing. So does the geography represent the current place of residence or place where initially settled?
Depends on the interactive application. So the one that's looking at economic outcomes, the line chart, that's looking at where they're currently living based on their tax data. The other graph referring to mobility, both. So you can select where they were intended to live, and you can select where they're living now, and you can filter from there. So if you wanted to know specifically about who intended to live in Ontario and then eventually lived in Quebec, you could look at that population in detail if you wanted to with that interactive application.
And then the next question is, what about provincial nominee program immigrants? I believe that's what the acronym is. Can we also track those, particularly the mobility analysis?
Yep, and any level of geography, any level all the way down to the CSD level. Although I'm not sure what, as I mentioned previously, once you start slicing and dicing too much, you get to these little numbers. And I won't be getting too much into the weeds at this instance, talking about data analysis. But I guess as a warning for users in the future, when you're looking at really small numbers of mobility, the primary indicator we use is called retention rate. So it's the proportion of those who stayed X amount of years later. For reasons of confidentiality, and like any data product in Statistics Canada, generally we apply things like random rounding, and we round to the 5 or the 10, depending on the level of information you're looking at. So you can imagine at small numbers, say for example, if you're looking at 15 out of 20 people stayed for a retention rate of 75%, that could look drastically different if you're looking at 15 out of 25 people stayed, or 10 out of 25 people stayed. So I guess just a warning for any users looking at small levels of data for mobility, when you're looking at something like a retention rate, just keep that in mind. So if you do see something that looks really zany or wonky, just make sure you look at the numbers as well. That might give you some information. Because generally, like I said, we round at the 10 or the 5 for population counts. So that's a little bit more information than you wanted. But yes, we have information about provincial nominee program immigrants. We don't have any information about the specific nominee program within provinces. So we don't know if, for example, Alberta nominated them or which specific stream of the Alberta nomination programs they were selected under. But I guess you could probably make the assumption that if they're intending to live in Alberta, then they were selected by that province. And yes, you could track their incomes and their mobility over time.
Perfect. So the next question, I think, is more of a, kind of around retention rates as well. So it reads, for retention rates, would it not be more accurate to capture whether an immigrant who filed taxes in one geography in the first year of arrival, as opposed to intended destination filed taxes in the same geography in subsequent years? Intended destination doesn't necessarily mean the immigrant lived in the geography in the first year of arrival.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are, I wouldn't say right or wrong, better or worse. I'd say it's a horizontal change. It's a different perspective of looking at it, and you could very well look at tax filing 1 year later and then tax filing 5 years later, come to a similar conclusion. I mean, I wouldn't say that's right or wrong. I would say that intended destination is a really good proxy for where they lived at year 0. So you could look at like mobility 1 year later, but you could also, as you described exactly, pick a tax year as a pin or as a peg and move from there. Would be my opinion rather than any official statement on mobility.
Right. The next question reads, I'm wondering if there could be links to housing data like tenure through tax files or other sources. There are some data for immigrants in census or CHSP, CHS, but I'd be keen to see if or how housing situations impact their retention rate, for example.
There are no plans, as I know, no plans now to link that type of data. The census is a reasonably good source of information for that kind of thing. Would be the best source of information for that kind of thing if you're looking at the subject matter of immigration. And that would be really interesting, especially when you're looking at it over time. But at this moment, no, we have no plans to look at that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think through the community data program, we do have target group profiles for immigrants, which would include census variables on housing. So right now, just for 2016 census, but we'll be acquiring those for 2021 census as well. And then Mike has a question here. So our members are interested in TFW data at local
foreign worker.
Yeah. Temporary for worker day, thank you. But the link from IRCC to the T4 can only be done at the provincial level. Do you know if there, sorry, the chat is moving. Do you know if there is any plan to get T4 data linked to IRCC data at lower levels of geography?
Right now, the data set that we're using the data set that we use to link the T4 to the IRCC data only includes provinces as low as we can go with that at the moment. There have been no talks about linking to anything else just because the T1FF includes data at lower levels of geography, but a big conversation we can have internally. So I'll, when I'll bring it up, we'll see what happens.
That would
No
be
promises.
very interesting for us, yeah, because I know we've looked into getting temporary foreign worker data before, and that was the explanation I was given, that there was this link that that was making it not possible. Anyway, that would be great.
I mean, I will say that temporary worker data is available with the quote unquote core IMDB and includes linkage to the T1FF file. The coverage isn't as good as with the T4 for the reasons I explained earlier, particularly the fact that temporary foreign workers are by nature transient in their stay in Canada. However, there's still fairly good coverage of the T1FF. So you could get some interesting information, although studying temporary foreign workers in Canada, especially economic outcomes, is fairly complicated, but it's a whole other soapbox I can go on for. I don't know if we have the time to do that today.
Perfect. Yeah, I do note that it is 2:30 Eastern time, so we can begin to wrap up. Yeah, again, thanks so much to both Eric and Mike for sharing all your knowledge on the IMDB table. I'm happy to stick around, and I know Eric said that he's available to stick around just for a couple more minutes, and I think Mike will be able to say as well, just if anyone has any last minute questions. But I do want to officially end the webinar for today and note that our next scheduled webinar is on October 11th, which we will be joined by Andrea and Kevin from Peel Region, and they'll be presenting an interactive webinar on the Peel Region Census Hub. And then Jamie, who many of you know from the Community Data Program, will also be providing a demonstration on how to import CDP data into QGIS. So essentially how to take the data from the catalog and make it into spatial data. And then, as Mike noted, based on the interest from today's webinar, we'll be looking into hosting more sessions on the IMDB tables. So yes, thanks for everyone who attended today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and all the materials will be posted on the coming days to the website.
To answer Satnam, no, we use Power BI for the data visualizations.
But we use Tableau if for our, we have some Tableau products, as Sasha mentioned.
Yes, Tala, you can probably stop the recording now, and then we can organize to upload the recording to the CDP website in the coming days.
Thank you.